Hi, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Sarah Milov, the author of The Cigarette, A Political History. This is Professor Milov's first book. She's a professor at the University of Virginia and focuses on the United States in the 20th century and how interest groups work. Professor Milov, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Evan.
We're thrilled for this discussion. I think it's going to be a great topic because cigarettes and, of course, their lobbyists, maybe even more so, have had such an impact. I looked up some statistics, and cigarette smoking is the leading cause of preventable disease in the United States, accounting for more than 480,000 deaths every year. And that's incredibly 1 in 5 people who die because of cigarettes. In the United States, most don't smoke, but there are still 35 million smokers here. And as I learned from your book, there's an entire lobby dedicated to keeping them legal and in the hands of everybody, but especially young people, because they can certainly make a lot of money if they start you young. So my first question is there any other product that we ingest that is so obviously destructive that has had the staying power of cigarettes?
I mean, I think you know the answer to that. It's obviously no. It's pretty clear that if a cigarette were to be invented today, it would not be legal. But the cigarette has tobacco and cigarettes more recently have tremendous staying power and political importance in the United States, which accounts for their longevity despite their lethality.
Yeah, so we definitely want to explain that. And so your book, let's go back to the beginning of all this. Now, you start the narrative in the early 1900s when there's this kind of divide that opens between tobacco farmers and those who work in the fields. You write that, and this is a quote, "The political economy of tobacco is a thicket of contradictions, fitting for a deadly substance that stimulates and relaxes." So if you can, explain 2 things. First of all, the roots of tobacco in what we now call the United States.
Well, tobacco's history within what is now the borders of the United States, go back even to the 17th century. Go back to the experiment at Jamestown and the exporting of tobacco back to England and from there on to Europe. And also it's intertwined with, obviously, enslavement and the use of African Americans as chattel slaves to produce this deadly but highly profitable substance. So tobacco has, its origins in the U.S. in plantation slavery. But what I think many people don't fully appreciate is the cigarettes history is actually much more recent. It's not until really the 1930s and especially the 1940s that cigarettes become the primary way to ingest tobacco.
So explain that. So how was it ingested before, and then when and why do cigarettes become popular?
Yeah, so in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, it's an era of industrialization, an era in which manufacturers are putting more money into mechanizing various processes that had been done by hand. And there's a cigarette rolling machine that's invented. There's actually many different cigarette rolling machines competing out there in the market, but one is designed, and that patent is bought by James Duke, and Duke incorporates this into his manufacturing processes, and he doesn't really see the benefit of it right away because even still in the late 19th century, human hand rollers, which is to say young children, because it's children that have the not just the dexterity but are a source of cheap labor, they are still seen to be more reliable and efficient than this rickety device. Eventually, the device itself is improved upon, and cigarettes become mass-produced. So the technological capacity to make mass-produced cigarettes precedes its uptake by most Americans. So why is this? Well, in the late 19th and early 20th century, cigarettes are seen as a vice. they're seen as something not wholly American. They're seen as something, and indeed they are something, that tends to be consumed and enjoyed by immigrants, specifically the types of immigrant populations that native stock Americans don't want in the country anymore. They're favored by Italians, Southern Europeans, and Jews. So it actually takes quite a few decades for the cigarette to become, in a sense, domesticated and seen as a habit that native-born Americans would partake in, and not just immigrant boys in New York City.
We're definitely going to talk about that, because it became such a symbol of masculinity and of gender. And as you write about that in the movies and things like that. So we are going to talk about that. But before we get to that, one of the arguments that you make is that the New Deal winds up being a pivotal moment in how this industry works. Can you explain why that is, and how the different rules around agriculture and the way the Roosevelt administration starts to approach how crops are grown changes how tobacco is grown and then ultimately distributed?
Yeah, I think when most people think about the New Deal, they think about unemployment relief. They think about Social Security. They might think about the power of labor unions getting a real boost. They might think about the amazing WPA posters and the creation of national parks. But one perhaps underappreciated element of the New Deal was the wholesale revolution in agriculture that it initiated. So prior to the New Deal, during the 1920s, in tobacco, it's a period where more people are smoking than before. And it's also a period where there's been a cratering of prices for other commodities, which means that during the 1920s, there are many more farmers who want to try their hand at tobacco. Now, once the Depression...
Why are they attracted to that? What is it about tobacco that makes them say, I can make a buck here?
It has a high labor requirement, but there's not that much capital that went into it. And in part, this is an interesting, unique feature of tobacco. Tobacco ends up being very late to mechanize. So whereas if you were producing, cotton or wheat, you might actually need to invest in more machinery. You might need a tractor or other types of agricultural equipment. In tobacco, if you had labor and some land, you could grow and make a decent profit at tobacco. It's a labor-intensive crop, but one that does not require a tremendous amount of acreage to be profitable, unlike, of course, the vast fields of wheat or corn.
So it's kind of dense in where it is.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
So during the 20s, more people are trying their hand at tobacco, particularly in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of Florida. And once the Depression hits, it poses kind of this conundrum. So the price of tobacco craters, but all an individual farmer can do in light of such a situation is to produce more and more tobacco, which further erodes the price. So what's individually rational for each farmer ends up being irrational on a population level. And this is kind of a classic collective action problem. And this problem is not just faced by tobacco farmers, it's faced by all farmers, but there's just been this expansion in tobacco acreage in the 1920s. So what the Roosevelt administration does is it says we have to stop this irrational production. We need to rationalize production and stop farmers from overproducing. And so what it does in tobacco is it basically says that whatever you produced as a farmer in 1933, you will produce half of that. And your license to produce, say, 3 acres of tobacco is going to be called your allotment. So it basically establishes a licensure system for production. And farmers are you can think of it as in exchange for growing on a quota system, they're guaranteed a minimum price at auction when they sell their tobacco. This is a huge intervention into how tobacco had been grown before, right? You could produce as much as you wanted, and you were free to receive as little as the tobacco companies offered you at auction. So this
And
is
now,
this.
yeah, and then so just explain the change again. So then now there's a bottom price.
There's a price floor set under under tobacco prices. So a farmer can't fall below a certain price. He's got, essentially, you can think of this as the agricultural equivalent to a minimum wage, which in fact many new dealers were kind of conceiving of these things at the same time, that there is a kind of minimum standard of living that we want to assure that Americans have. And a large percentage of Americans were still involved in agricultural pursuits. So having these price minima made a lot of sense if your goal overall, taking a step back from agriculture, if your goal overall were to re-inject, purchasing power. You wanted to get Americans spending again. So this type of dramatic intervention into the market made a whole lot of sense if you just wanted to get those dollars flowing.
Yeah. So now that the dollars are flowing, and now that they've got these kind of, this government intervention on their behalf, then your narrative kind of turns to the kind of commercialization of the tobacco and the cigarettes themselves. And, one thing so many of us are familiar with is the advertisement, because we've all Google imaged the ads, and we've seen, looking back 70, 80 years later, how sort of ridiculous it was to see them talking about these things like they're going to give you health and vibrancy and all the things that we know now are the opposite of what cigarettes give you. And also maybe because of the show Mad Men, which shows how ad companies came up with this idea to call cigarettes. I'll never forget this line. They wanted to call cigarettes toasted, in quotes. And there's a line in Mad Men where they say to each other, all we have to do is make people think they're going to be happy. So how can you describe how cigarettes are advertised before there was this kind of widespread acceptance that these things were not good for you?
Well, the history of tobacco and the history of advertising are entirely intertwined. The advertising industry in the United States really revs up actually in the 1920s, the first kind of consumer boom in the United States, where many different products are being advertised in new ways, in color advertisements, in magazines, with advertising agencies hiring more and more people to work for them. And also it's related to broader changes in politics. So during the 1920s is an era of Republican presidents, Republican rule in Congress, an era where, famously the business of government is business, and there's these huge tax cuts. And what businesses do with the tax cuts in many instances, and was true with tobacco, is to plow that money into advertising. And so, the tobacco advertisements kind of become more prominent in the 1920s. And I think it might surprise some people to know that Marlboros were, now this symbol of, rugged masculinity, the cowboy and all that, were initially advertised to pursue the women's market. They were advertised as mild as May.
And you see all these ads where they show like a woman in sort of a bathing attire, whatever passed for it back then, and they're slender and they're happy and they're holding a cigarette.
Right. Yes. Lucky Strikes had this.
For us to see it.
Yeah, I know, right? Lucky Strikes had this advertising campaign that on the one hand was trying to exploit kind of the association between suffrage and liberation and smoking, but on the other hand, play into women's anxieties. So they had this whole campaign called "Reach for a Lucky Instead of a Sweet," where you'd show an overweight woman diving into a pool, and then a slender woman with a Lucky Strike in her hand.
Right. This is your antidote, right? This is the antidote.
Right. Don't eat, smoke instead.
Perfect idea. Um, uh, uh, did everyday people believe the advertising? Sometimes we'll see an ad for something today, and you look at the person next to you, and you go, "Oh, come on, I know that's not true." Did everyday people buy this?
Well, if you judge by the increasing numbers of people who smoked, the advertising was having an effect. And if you judge by the amount of money that the cigarette companies were putting into spending on advertising, they sure believed it was having an effect.
Right.
And I think if you just think about, you know, our recollections of those times, or let's think about Hollywood movies, another industry that grew up alongside the cigarette. Um, you know, this contributed to how people understood what a cigarette was and the meaning that they invested in it. So, I don't know if people really believed necessarily all of the claims that were made,
Yeah.
by cigarettes, but their consciences were surely assuaged by the fact, for example, that Chesterfield featured advertisements with physicians in them.
Right. And we all see, I'm a doctor and I smoke these.
Exactly.
Those ad. Explain how they got into movies, because I think it's just fascinating when you watch, a movie from the 40s or 50s, and it's like ubiquitous. There's the white male is holding the cigarette and he's proud of it, and it has become this kind of status symbol that I'm a strong, cowboy, and I don't go anywhere without these.
Yeah, I think overall in the history of the 20th century history of tobacco, the a lot of these images that we have about tobacco reflect different ways of organizing the economy. So the studio system in Hollywood, which was a system of basically cartel organization by major studios, where the studio would basically own a film product, and also down through the distribution chain, all the way down to the movie theaters, but also own the labor of actors who were signed to a particular studio. Those studios had contracts with the cigarette companies. So this cartelization in cigarette firms was mirrored by a cartelization amongst the Hollywood studios. And so the studios would tell their stable of actors, appear with these in your hand, or we're going to have a movie where this brand might be shown, or at the very least, you'll be shown smoking. Ronald Reagan, for example, during his work in the studio system, was also did advertisements for Chesterfield cigarettes.
So they literally put cigarettes in the hands of famous actors, knowing that this was going to be a successful tool.
Yes, and celebrities were used in print advertising for those particular brands too.
It's amazing. Was this among the first type of product placements, or had that been always going on?
I'm not sure I know about, if I could say like what was the first, but given, even during the 1940s, like given the strength and prominence of the tobacco industry, it was probably the most important.
Yeah. And so here's another question about this, and forgive me if I'm going too far with this, but it reminds me of like in Home Alone when someone says, Fuller, go easy on the Pepsi. Did they talk brands in the movies, or was it merely just the cigarette as a generic symbol?
I think as a generic symbol, but what was absolutely specific is for the print advertisements, where you'd see an image of a celebrity Lucille Ball smoking, and then there'd be like a quote underneath about why she preferred this or that brand. That was a reflection of agreements hammered out between industry and between respective industries, Hollywood and the cigarette industry.
All right. So this is all leading up to 1964, and this is actually the opening scene in your book. And there's this press conference where the Surgeon General, Luther Terry, is going to announce that the results of their report. They have done a report that was hundreds of pages. I think you said it was 400 pages. And there was anger among the reporters that there were no smoking signs suddenly put up in the room where the press conference was going to be. But describe the change that goes through public opinion after this press conference where the Surgeon General announces, hey, folks, this is what cigarettes do.
Yeah, so in 1964, the Surgeon General, who, by the way, prior to cigarettes, the figure of the Surgeon General was not all that important. I'm not sure that many people could name who the Surgeon General is today, but let's just say in eras past, between 1964 and let's say 2016, people may have known who the Surgeon General was. Cigarettes make the Surgeon General a figure of importance. But Luther Terry announces during a press conference, which, by the way, is held on a Saturday so as not to roil the stock market, that the results of 2 years long intensive study by a panel of nation's top doctors and scientific public health experts are in, and that they have concluded that cigarettes cause lung cancer and cardiovascular disease. And even the composition of this panel reflected the influence of the tobacco industry. Obviously, the tobacco industry was vitally interested in any government panel designed to interrogate public health research about the relationship of smoking and disease. And obviously, Luther Terry understood that this would be a significant political document. So Terry basically sought out to create a politically unimpeachable document by allowing the tobacco industry to veto any name put forth to serve on the panel. So that way, basically, the tobacco industry was able to make sure that from its perspective, nobody automatically suspect, nobody with a long history of anti-cigarette positions would end up on the panel. And also in service of Terry's goal of having a politically unimpeachable document, 5 people on the panel were to be non-smokers and 5 people were to be smokers. Now, by the end of the panel's meetings, only a couple were smokers. The rest had quit. Terry himself had given up the habit and moved to smoking an occasional pipe. But this announcement, did garner a lot of attention, but it didn't change people right away. After a couple months slump in cigarette sales, they were buoyant and back again by 1965.
And so how long does it take for public opinion to go, these may not be so good?
So what I found in my research and what I show in the book is, the major turning point is not this, federal proclamation that cigarettes are harmful, that cigarettes can kill you, in fact. What was a major turning point was the advent of what I call the non-smokers' rights movement. Right. And this movement really got liftoff in the early 1970s. And, its agents were not agents of the federal government. They were not necessarily people who had backgrounds in public health, but in many cases were women, sometimes housewives, who, beseeched their local city council people to change laws at the local level to make it difficult to smoke in public places.
Yeah, and they're basically saying, I don't smoke, why should I be subject to it?
Yeah, their argument is kind of libertarian. It's, you can smoke if you want, but don't subject me to your habit. I don't want to breathe in your disgusting air.
Yeah, and it's funny because nowadays, certainly if someone is smoking inside, it's like people turn around immediately and go, wow, where's that coming from? But back then there was this kind of push and pull between how much rights or how many rights each group had. And your argument is that non-smoking became just as much of a status, if not more so, than the smokers.
Yeah, I mean, what the non-smokers' rights movement sought to do was to make smoking, in their words, socially unacceptable. And this was a deliberate tactic that understood that as long as the cigarette industry could continue to frame smoking as just an individual choice, then non-smokers would not win. Because if it was an individual choice, you can't necessarily control what somebody else does. And if there's a warning label on the pack, well, then the individual has been warned. It's his decision whether or not he will accept the risk.
And then
So,
how does the, oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
right. So the goal of the non-smokers' rights movement was to say all of that stuff about individual risk is well and fine in the confines of your own home, but as soon as you get outside, you're subjecting me to your choice.
Yeah, and so now that the industry senses this threat, how do they respond, both with advertising and with how they distribute their product?
Well, so at first, these activists have this remarkable success at the local level. By 1975, there were hundreds of ordinances passed all across the country that by our standards today would not seem that striking. For example, they might they might call for non-smoking sections of certain public spaces like movie theaters or libraries, or maybe they'll ban smoking entirely in certain public buildings or spaces of certain public buildings. But by our standards today, you'd say, well, you're definitely in a world where tobacco smoke is ubiquitous. And there's industry documents that basically show that the industry was caught flat-footed, that they were caught, unawares that this trouble was brewing out in the States. And so what the industry eventually figures out how to do, but this is not till the 1980s. This is after a decade in which the non-smokers' rights movement had rooted, at least in some way, in the public consciousness, was to pass laws that are known as preemption laws, which basically are so that a state in a state house would pass a law that is weaker than a local law. Mm-hmm. And preemption is a kind of a legal doctrine of U.S. federalism that says a locality cannot go further than where the state can go. Yes, you see them. I mean, you see them in Virginia with Confederate monuments. Right. Locality can't vote to take down their monuments. So they try this preemption gambit in the 1980s that did, and 1990s, that did for a while dampen enthusiasm for local ordinances.
Let's talk about the decline of smoking rates. It's significant, and it's certainly, I would think would be seen as a success among policymakers, at least those who are against smoking. 67% of adults 50 years ago were smoking, and then it was 42% in 1965, 14% in 2017. And youth smoking has fallen even further, 68% to 8.8% in that same time period. So smoking rates have declined, and in some ways this has worked.
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing that, following the trajectory of the cigarette over a longer period of time, one dynamic that it illuminates are the ways in which the opponents of smoking helped to foster a political culture that was fundamentally elitist. So non-smoking rights activists were, for the most part, white and educated and middle class. And they pursued a kind of activism that sought to wield stigma as a tool of public policy. So, for example, at workplaces, non-smoking activists would basically argue that smoking workers were bad workers, that they took breaks, that they damaged equipment, that they were sick too much, and therefore workplaces should adopt non-smoking policies. And you would see this even out in the public sphere too, that smokers are a drain on taxpayers. And so, the kind of political culture that the non-smokers' rights movement fostered, sometimes purposefully, sometimes unwittingly, or sometimes just because they were throwing anything at the wall and that's what stuck, is one I think that that is reflected in who still smokes today. Smokers tend to be, poorer and less educated than non-smokers. And I don't think that there's a wellspring of sympathy for people that smoke.
Interesting. I guess that leads perfectly into this next question, which is, has there ever been an effort to actually ban cigarettes? Now, we did see President Trump sort of toy with this idea of whether it would be okay to make restrictions even tighter on electronic cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
But has there ever been an effort to actually say these need to be illegal in the United States?
Yes. So one goes back to the deeper history of cigarettes that we spoke of at the beginning of our conversation. In the early 20th century, there were, I guess you could call them, smoking temperance advocates. And this is coming right out of a kind of eugenicist, nativist line of thinking that succeeded in passing very early anti-smoking ordinances, and they spoke about wanting to ban smoking. They were smoking prohibitionists. But that history aside, today in public health circles, there are scholars and researchers who speak of the tobacco end game, and they do advocate for the prohibition of cigarettes, though I have not seen any evidence that there's been uptake of this idea by politicians.
And why? We know how dangerous they are. Why? Why don't people say, this is costing taxpayers, this is costing the healthcare system, this is a tax on our hospitals, people are dying, families are saying goodbye to loved ones. Why hasn't that taken hold?
I think, that's a really interesting question. And my mind goes to two places. And maybe they're actually related. I'd like to know what you think. First is, we are numb to that 480,000, 500,000 deaths each year. The political system has metabolized this into something that we're willing to accept. And because there is still the idea that people choose to smoke, despite the fact that there's decades upon decades now of research that says most people who begin smoking begin as teenagers, begin before, the legal age of majority, before they can truly consent, and they become addicted. So despite that, there's still that argument that the tobacco industry pursued in 1965 still continues to pay dividends in how we think about smokers. And I suppose our more unfortunate and recent brush with mass excess death in this society is showing the willingness of society to tolerate hundreds of thousands of people each year dying.
And what's interesting to me is that I know you're talking about coronavirus there,
Mm-hmm.
but coronavirus itself didn't lie to us, whereas the cigarette companies did lie. And yet there's still an acceptance that this is the cost of doing business in America.
Yeah, absolutely. And that argument that the individual chooses to smoke, that argument brilliantly pioneered in the 1960s, I think is still operative. My other answer, I think, might go to the direct, corporate question that you're pressing, which is, I think that the rhetorical value of the alcohol prohibition movement is tremendous across a wide range of corporate domains. During post 1960s, the tobacco industry branded anybody who wanted any amount of cigarette regulation, as a prohibitionist and a zealot. And so I think that the experiment in prohibition, which most people now today would not like to undergo again, is a mental block in thinking about other commodities and practices we don't want to have in society.
So then the question then becomes, is this industry going to still be here in 50 years? Are we still going to have smokers and cigarettes? You know, pick
Yeah. Yes, though what people smoke, I don't know I don't know if it will look like a traditional combustible cigarette, right? Like as the popularity of e-cigarettes, especially among young people, grows. I'm not sure that once the Z generation is 40, if they continue to be addicted to nicotine, I don't suspect it will be in the form of a combustible cigarette. But I think that if you look at the long history of substance use, not just in America, but in the world, I think that it's hard to imagine this society not using nicotine. And if the society is using nicotine, it is hard for me to imagine that the cigarette industry, the tobacco industry, would not figure out a way to deliver it at a profit.
I was gonna, the way I had it written down here is, I'm afraid to ask, can the industry survive? I was going to ask, how is it going to survive? Because it always has survived. And you answered that question. Lastly, how can the fight against cigarettes and that industry inform us about the battles with other lobbying groups? Environmental ones come to mind, oil, etc.
Yeah, I think, the story of tobacco, people speak of the tobacco playbook to point at the perfidy and deceitfulness of industry, and as well they should. But I think the tobacco playbook also holds really hopeful and inspiring lessons for activists. What the anti-tobacco playbook shows is that really meaningful action can be taken on a local level. That action can be meaningful in its own right, in that it can inspire the passage of laws, local laws, let's say, that change people's practices. But in inspiring those laws and in organizing around local laws, movements can develop that could press for more substantive action at the federal level. And so I actually think this history, like all histories, is complicated, but there are lessons that I think perhaps climate activists or anti-gun activists could extract.
Fascinating. Professor Sarah Milov, author of The Cigarette, A Political History. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Evan.
We appreciate it. Certainly check out her book, The Cigarette, A Political History. Also, she's active on Twitter. She's a great tweeter, so make sure you check that out. She's at All of Milov, ALLOFMILOV on Twitter. Fantastic Twitter feed. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, with guest announcements and book recommendations. We will see you next time. Thanks.